Welcome to College Football Live, presented by Dr. Pepper.
There was going to be a choice whether they're going to keep fighting or surrender.
Welcome into the Thursday edition of College Football Live. Matt Schick, Emmanuel Acho, and Jonathan Vilma. Week 11 just got a heck of a lot more interesting, fellas, as one of the top 4 teams in the college football playoff rankings will be sidelined. Will have their quarterback sidelined this week. Ian Book, quarterback for Notre Dame, will be out this week against Florida State after sustaining an undisclosed injury. ESPN sources saying that it's a rib injury sustained on that play against the Wildcats. That means Brandon Wimbush, who led the team to that big win against Michigan in Week 1, is back in at quarterback here to Week 11 against Florida State. Acho, what's the impact here of Book's injury and absence for the Irish?
If it's just this week, there's minimal impact. Not because Notre Dame's not going to suffer, because they will. Ian Book is a significant upgrade, especially when it comes to throwing the football over Brandon Wimbush, who's a phenomenal runner. But let's be honest, gentlemen. Florida State is not a good football team. They haven't been all season. Willie Taggart blaming the players blaming the coaches. It's just a complete mess, so Notre Dame should be able to escape this week.
Yeah, they should be able to escape, Acho, but I wouldn't discount Florida State, especially on the defensive side of the ball. He's counting out, Willie Taggart is calling out his players, but defensively, they've played well enough to win. It's the offense that's been atrocious. So if Brandon Wimbush can't bring a passing game to this game Saturday, you're looking at a very close game late in the game. You could see Florida State finding a way to pull it out.
It's going to be interesting, guys. Late. That's my thing, is I'm not sure that it's going to be close late, JV, because ultimately Florida State, they're just bad. Defensively, offensively, special teams, head coach, assistant coaches. I mean, you watch their games against Clemson, against NC State, they don't even look like a competent ball club.
It's going to be interesting, guys. We just showed their schedule. Florida State this week, then a neutral site game, Yankee Stadium against Syracuse. It's going to be interesting to see how the committee views a loss if they do sustain one. Guys, remember last year, Clemson lost to Syracuse with a banged-up Kelly Bryant, and then he was concussed and eventually left that game. But that loss was in October, and Clemson also had an ACC championship game to look forward to. This is November, no conference championship game. JV, how do you think the committee would view a loss down the stretch here, considering this injury?
Man, Schick, you just took my point, because I was first going to say conventional wisdom says it opens the door up if Notre Dame loses to the Pac-12 and Washington State and to the Big 12 winner. But the committee has to be consistent. And if they're going to be consistent like they did last year, where they said, oh, we're going to scratch off and give Clemson a mulligan because they didn't have their starting quarterback, he got hurt in that game, then it's the same scenario for Notre Dame. You have to give them a mulligan if it's a close loss, they lose by a field goal, they lose in overtime, and you say, well, they didn't have their starting quarterback. They're a different team when Ian Book is in the game and when Brandon Wimbush is in the game.
False. JV, I got to call you out on this one. It's not apples to apples. Last year, Clemson had an ACC title game, which they beat the mess out of Miami, if I'm not mistaken. Sorry to bring up an old wound. But furthermore, Notre Dame's allowed no grace. Notre Dame's allowed no freedom because they don't have a championship game. They have some big wins this season. They have some huge wins this season. But when you don't play in that championship game, that is your mulligan. That is your freebie. Because when you're chilling, other teams are fighting for their lives in a huge matchup which dictates everything.
No, Acho, clearly the committee has said that the championship games aren't the end-all, be-all. You've seen conference championship teams not make the playoffs. You've seen one-loss teams that didn't even play in their championship game make the playoffs. So Notre Dame does not have some extra outside incentive to play in a championship game. They can be treated just like Alabama, just like other teams that have gone in that didn't even play in their championship game.
Well, yeah, if you're going to lose a game, maybe you'd have more of an excuse if you lose this week to Florida State, and then you put a number on Syracuse next week when you have him. But hopefully he's 100%. But let's play this out in this week's Wendy's Fresh Look. Let's take a look at a couple of scenarios involving Notre Dame and a potential L. How about this first scenario? Let's go with scenario 1. Alabama, Clemson, Ohio State, and Oklahoma win out, and Notre Dame ends up 11-1. Emmanuel Acho, who's in scenario 1?
In scenario 1, give me Alabama, Clemson, Ohio State, and Oklahoma. Notre Dame, I'm sorry, I'll see you later. But if Oklahoma's only loss is to Texas at a neutral site, they're in. If Ohio State's loss was an ugly loss, but to Purdue in mid-October, they're in as well.
Well, Acho, I'm putting Notre Dame in ahead of Oklahoma. If Notre Dame's only loss is to a Florida State team without their starting quarterback, then again, the committee has to be consistent like they did last year, and they still kept Clemson in the top 4 after that loss to Syracuse. So there's no reason why they're going to deviate from what they did last year and say, oh, sorry, all of a sudden you lost. It's a bad loss. You can't do that. One year can't be different than the next year. That's the reason we have the committee in.
Alabama, Clemson, Michigan. They all win out. So does Washington State. Notre Dame loses a game, so they're sitting there at 11-1. And the Big 12 champ has 2 losses, whether it's West Virginia or Oklahoma, a 2-loss Big 12 champ. JV, who's in that scenario?
I'm going with Notre Dame again in that scenario, depending how they lose. And again, it's only if they lose without Ian Book in the game. So this is Florida State game we're talking about. Depending how they lose, if it's OT, lose by a field goal late in the game, something like that happens, I still see Notre Dame has a better strength of record. I still say Notre Dame passes the eye test. And I still say Notre Dame would beat Washington State on a neutral site if they have Ian Book as a starting quarterback.
I'm going to give JV this one, mainly because Notre Dame has the brand. If we're being frank, I don't know who would win Notre Dame-Washington State neutral site, but Notre Dame has the big-time wins. Notre Dame has the brand, and if Notre Dame has 1 loss and Washington State has their 1 loss to USC in September, then I'll ride with Notre Dame and the Fighting Irish.
Yeah, and Washington State winning out, that non-conference schedule, that's just so hard to overcome. They might have hit their ceiling with where they are right now. All right, I'm going to throw one more at you. It's one that's been talked about a whole heck of a lot here on our airwaves. Clemson, Notre Dame, Michigan. They all win out. Georgia beats Alabama. Call it a close one in the SEC championship game. You can only slot 4. Who's getting in there, Emmanuel?
Give me this one. Thanks for coming to me first, Schick. If Georgia beats Bama, Georgia's in. It's a no-brainer. Anybody that beats Bama deserves to be in. Then Bama, they're obviously in if their 1 loss is to Georgia. Give me Notre Dame as well. The toss-up is going to be between Michigan and Clemson. Michigan would have 1 loss, but they have more significant wins. I think at the end, the edge has to go to Clemson if they end up undefeated. Those would be my 4.
Wow, I don't understand how an undefeated Clemson is all of a sudden in a race to be in the playoffs with a 1-loss Michigan. That makes no sense at all. It would be between Michigan and Alabama, those 2 teams. And the reason why is because you have undefeated. Winning matters, Acho. If you're undefeated, you're in. There's no way that they have a competition undefeated and a 1-loss team.
Let me pose this, JV. Let me pose this. If Michigan's 1 loss is the first week of the season at South Bend with a brand new quarterback in Shea Patterson, again, week 1 of the season, that has to be taken into consideration. That's a completely different Michigan team, September 1st to December 2nd.
But Acho, Clemson didn't lose. That's what you're missing. You're talking about a 1-loss
in this
team.
scenario.
Clemson didn't lose.
Clemson doesn't lose in this scenario, Manuel. We're talking
They're
really
undefeated.
Alabama. Are you putting Alabama in, even with the loss to Georgia in the SEC, or are you putting Michigan, Emmanuel?
Alabama goes in for sure. And I understood the scenario. I understood it thoroughly. But if Alabama's only losses to Georgia in the SEC championship, Alabama's in. You saw how they dismantled LSU. Alabama's in, no question. I'm just saying Michigan needs. Michigan
Where
needs
does
more
this SEC
credit.
bias come from? This is what I'm trying to understand. You went to Texas, Big 12 guy. Why do you have such a bias for Alabama and the SEC? There is no reason it's a foregone conclusion Bama is in there. Michigan looks just as good as Bama, except for the offensive side. Defensively, they look good. Strength of record is better. They would play tougher games. I mean, how is it such a clear cut Bama goes in? That's crazy.
JV, you just said Michigan looks as good as Bama. I'm done with
the
that.
On defense, they do.
The predictor has Alabama on the outside looking in. But by the way, if Alabama did make it as the 4, what a great reward for the #1 team, Clemson, right? Hey, here's Alabama again. Congratulations. Just like last year, you get to face them.